This week we're going to be talking about the special senses. This is going to go with chapter 8 in your textbook. So we have some general senses. These are going to include like the sensory receptors that are going to be scattered throughout the body and pick up information like touch, pain, hunger, temperature, pressure, that kind of stuff. And then we're going to have what we call our special senses, and that's what this lecture is going to be about. These are going to be senses that have a specific sensory organ associated with them. So these are going to include taste, and the organ for that is going to be the tongue, smell, and the organ for that is the nose, hearing and balance, which is the ear, and vision, which is the eyes. This first part 1 lecture will focus on taste and smell, and the part 2 lecture will focus on hearing and vision. Okay, so here's a little bit about how this works. So special sensory receptor cells will pick up on signals from the environment, and then they will transmit action potentials to sensory neurons, which are going to then transmit that message to the inner neurons in the brain and the spinal cord to be interpreted. We talked a little bit about this last week when we were talking about our afferent and efferent nerve signals and those synapses and how all those signals are transmitted down the neuron. We're going to have a few different types of sensory receptors. We'll have thermoreceptors. These are going to sense temperature. You know that from that prefix thermo there. Mechanoreceptors. These sense pressure, touch, or position. Nociceptors are going to be our receptors that sense pain. These are really, really interesting types of receptors. We also have photoreceptors. Photoreceptors sense light, and chemoreceptors sense specific chemicals. It's really helpful as you're going through these lectures and trying to get this content if you pay close attention to these prefixes on these words, because like thermo, mechano, photo, chemo, all of these things have very specific meanings. So sometimes if you don't necessarily know what a word means, but you know how to speak the language of biology and speak the language of science, then you will be able to get pretty close to figuring out what that meaning is. So take some time, think about on your own where you think each of these different types of receptors would be found within the body. Here is another table that I gave you guys just as another study tool. So we talked about cranial nerves last time. Many of the cranial nerves are going to be involved in carrying sensory input to the brain. 10 of the 12 cranial nerves are going to branch off of the brainstem, and 2 are going to branch off of the cerebrum. And we talked a lot about this last week, so I'm not going to dive too deep into that. If you need to refresh, you can just go back and rewatch that lecture. If you're still confused, you can reach out to me. So let's talk a little bit about taste and smell. So we refer to the sense of taste as gustation, and the sense of smell as olfaction. Those are just the very sciencey words for what those two sensations are called. These are going to rely on chemoreceptors, which detect chemicals. And this is a reason why taste and smell are so closely related. They're very, very cohesive senses. Flavor that we taste is actually going to be a combination of taste and smell together. So the organ for taste is going to be the tongue. The tongue is going to be covered in little raised projections we call papillae. These are going to contain our taste buds. So the taste buds actually contain these cells with the chemoreceptors that are picking up on those chemicals. And these chemicals, the way this works is these chemicals have to be dissolved into the saliva, and then once they're dissolved into the saliva, we're able to isolate those chemicals so that they can interact with these receptors. So here's some of the cranial nerves of the tongue. We have the motor nerves, which are going to be the vagus nerves and the hypoglossal nerve. And then we also have a lot of sensory nerves. So the vagus and the glossopharyngeal are sensory nerves, and then also the trigeminal and the facial are sensory nerves that help out the tongue. So different receptors can help us to detect different nutrients in food. So we have a few different flavor profiles. that help relay messages to our brain whenever we were just out in the wilderness eating random things. This could relay a message to our brain, kind of letting our brain know what nutrients we were getting, or if we were eating something that could be dangerous to us so that we could avoid it. So bitterness receptors are extremely sensitive. The purpose of these is to help us recognize different toxins or other potentially harmful materials, or things that are fine in small quantities but really, really not okay in large quantities. So that is why bitterness exists. Our sweet sensation is to recognize sugars and carbohydrates, because we know that that is so important for like getting the energy that we need to be able to turn into glucose and all of that into ATP in our system. Salty is going to recognize the compounds that contain electrolytes. If you've ever had a blood draw at like a doctor's office, you know that whenever you look at that, it's like sodium and potassium, and reading the label of a blood test sometimes looks like reading the label of a Gatorade bottle, right? So salty helps us recognize those electrolytes that are so important for our body's functioning. Sourness is going to be in foods with high amounts of acid usually, or acidic vitamins, because we do need acids in small quantities, right? And umami is going to be activated by high protein foods, such as soy sauce or cheese or things like that. We also have the sensation of being able to kind of taste fat, and fat is going to be activated by foods that are high in those lipids and fatty acids, because we do need fats in moderation, right? We need that for things like making up our plasma membranes and things like this, cholesterol, which is then all of our steroid hormones in the body. These things all go back to the fats that we are taking in from the environment. So fats can be very important, and we can't really live without them. So other substances can activate our thermoreceptors and provide the sensation of cold and hot as well. So we have a few different things there. So we used to think that the tongue was divided into specific areas. So like you had this area in the back that would taste bitter and the front of your tongue was sweet. This is what I learned when I was a kid. This is a myth. So this is not actually accurate. You will find all of the types of the different taste receptors throughout the surface of the tongue. And just different ones will be activated based on the chemical that they're coming into contact with. Let's talk a little bit about the sense of smelling and the nasal cavity. So smell is also going to rely on these chemoreceptors, but it is going to be located in the roof of the nasal cavity. So you can see in this diagram right here, we have the olfactory bulb, right, coming off of that olfactory nerve, and then you have all of these nerves like stretching out from that. So this is how we are getting our sense of smell. Sorry. My lights just went off in my classroom. I went dark on you guys for a minute. So we refer to this as the olfactory mucosa. Again, this is going to contain those olfactory nerve endings, which are going to transmit signals to that olfactory bulb, and then from there into the brain. Smells have been shown to be strongly linked to memories. And the reason for this is because the olfactory bulb is linked tightly with the limbic system. If you remember last week when we were talking about the brain, we talked a lot about the limbic system and how this is kind of, this is where we're encoding memories. This is kind of one of the most like fundamental parts of our brain as far as making us who we are and guiding our reactions and things like this. So this is why you can walk into a place and go, whoa, this is my grandma's house. And then all those memories will float back. Or you taste a food and it takes you back to an earlier time when you had that food before. It is because smell and taste are very, very highly linked to the limbic system. So that is all that I have for lecture 1. I will post lecture 2, in which we are going to cover hearing and vision. And yeah, as always, if you have any questions or you're stuck on any of this stuff, please reach out and I'm here for you. Thanks.